Welcome to Extra Literary Affairs, a LitFiction podcast. In this series, we're going to dive deeper into specific themes and topics that we can't fully explore in our main show. It's a space for us to unleash our creativity and discuss our ideas in more detail. Think of it as a companion to our main podcast. Just don't tell them about us. No need to make them jealous. Hello, I'm Jennifer, and this is Extra Literary Affairs, a lit fiction podcast. Today I'm joined by Joey as we dive a bit deeper into Flannery O'Connor. Recently, we discussed her masterfully crafted short story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, for the Lit Fiction podcast. That story and many of its implications have been on my mind since then, particularly the idea of authorial intent, which is harder to say than one might think, and if it is even worth considering the author's intention in light of a masterful work. So, Joey, thank you for joining me here today. And I'm really curious about where you stand on the idea of authorial intent. Does it matter what the author intended or not?
This just so happens to be a very scholarly debate. This is something that, and Colin brought this up too in the original podcast, is that there are obviously two schools of thought. One being that authorial intent is irrelevant to the work because the work stands alone. It's not attached to its person anymore after it is written and published and put out into the world and read. And then there's the school of thought that thinks that authorial intent is incredibly important to understanding a work and then being able to understand the nuance and the purpose of whatever the text is about. I would say that I'm in the middle where I think I like to, and I think this is true for you and probably for Colin, that I think we all like to understand a bit of the history of the author themselves, whoever it is, in this case, Flannery O'Connor, to help guide our discussion and see if we can find the real world inspiration that comes through in the writing. But I don't know that it's not important to understanding or liking the story, but I think for me, it's important.
Thanks for bringing that up, Joey, because what has been really bothering me, and I couldn't shake this, and that's why I asked you to come on and talk about this with me today, is that the more I learned about Flannery O'Connor's background and who she was and the time in which she wrote, her own personal struggles in her life, her Catholicism, her lupus, her education, her living in Georgia, I made all of these judgments about who she was and what she was about. And I realized for me, I needed to dig a little bit deeper to find out if some of my inklings about her background, her apparent racism, about her religious background, were they interfering or adding some nuance to the stories that I couldn't quite put my hands on. And so when we started this discussion, Joey, you did such a great thing for me. We talked through this a little bit and you pointed me in the direction of an amazing article from The New Yorker.
Mm.
And I'd like to put that into our show notes so people can reference it. But I'm just going to read the title of this article. And I was like, yeah, Joey, this is exactly the article I needed to read and
Yeah.
listen to because the article says it's a critic at large piece from June 15th, 2020. So 4.5 years old. And the title is How Racist Was Flannery O'Connor? She has become an icon of American letters. Now readers are reckoning with another side of her legacy. I highly recommend anyone who is curious about her background to read that article because one of the things that I found extremely interesting, and it did help me reframe how I was viewing her experience and how her experience was influencing my experience reading her story, 70 years later,
Mhm.
is that she made carbon copies, right? When you could use a typewriter or pieces of carbon paper to record all of her letters that she was writing privately to her friends and her family with the intention that those would be collected and amassed because she was very concerned that she was going to die young because of complications of her lupus. And that prediction in her life did come true. She died at 39. So, Joey, one of the questions I had asked you offline was, is it right for your friends and family to publish your private correspondence after your death without your knowledge? By sharing with me this really well-researched article from 2020, it was clear that she was writing with the intention that these would be memorialized. So I have to think as a reader and as a writer, if you make your living. You express yourself so beautifully in words that if you leave a legacy behind of content that you want people to read, I'm going to say that's a pretty clear representation of who you are, perhaps.
Mm.
So Joey, where do you land on that idea?
I think I agree with you that her intent with these letters was for them to be memorialized and read, accessible to future generations. I don't think that she had as much fame. She was not part of like the literary canon during her lifetime, I believe, but she definitely has risen in the ranks and is definitely a part of the canon now, rubbing elbows with Faulkner and Ernest Hemingway and all those other people. So I think it's very different from when we read like Kafka's letters, where those are extremely intimate. And he's telling us, well, he didn't mean to. He's telling someone, whoever the letter at that time was directed to, whether it's his father or one of the some woman that he would, I don't know, ask Khan.
One of his
um,
girlfriends, some woman.
like some woman that I think he wanted to marry. I don't know. I forget. But these are very like intimate letters that are full of very personal things. He's very vulnerable in them. And I think because Flannery O'Connor was writing them with the intention for these to be shared with people who would never know her, that she was probably, and I'm guessing here, she was probably more mindful of what she was going to put in the letters, which I think makes them almost even more credible because there's less emotion. Like when we read Franz Kafka's letters, he's a very emotional and insecure person. And I think we can all relate to a lot of things that he writes about, even in his letters, but also in his fiction. You have a tendency to over exaggerate. If you're just talking, if I was going to write a letter to you, I could over exaggerate and you would get it because you know the nuance of my actual life. But O'Connor was writing it because this is how I think she wanted people to see her in the future. Just to go back to that New Yorker article, which I'm sure we're both going to reference quite a bit, is that there is a letter from 1948 to the director of Yaddo, the writers' colony in upstate New York. I guess that's how you pronounce it. And she's talking about attending a Ku Klux Klan meeting. So why would she write this in a letter and then save it if she did not want us to know that she had attended a Ku Klux Klan meeting? So obviously she's dabbling in white supremacy, whether she accidentally stumbled upon this. I've never seen one of these events, so I don't know if you could just
You could just
accidentally walk up
happen
to one.
upon one. I just turned the
Yeah,
corner and magically there's a KKK rally.
yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, in that time frame. Again, it's like it's
Yeah,
not contemporary. It is like in that time
in
and
Georgia
in
too.
Georgia. And but Joey, what I really appreciate about the way that it was written in the letter is that she still is crafting this beautiful story where she says, "Oh, it's too hot to burn a real cross because it's
Yeah,
like summer. So we brought a cross that was emblazoned with electric light." And you could
yeah.
hear you could hear, 100 men in sheets stomping the ground. And so even with this, in my mind, very vile content, which one's contrary
Hmm.
to my personal experience, what I would like to experience in my life, she still has this poetic, clear-eyed, and beautiful way of expressing things that I'm just so annoyed. And it's very funny. And I think, so oftentimes we talk about how we experience a piece of literature says a lot more about ourselves than it does about the literature as it's written. And I think I'm just particularly vulnerable at this point in history, thinking about how to separate what I will call like unsavory content or content I wish was not part of our shared historical and lived experience as people in the United States. And the truth of if you brush it under the rug and 100 years from now, nobody knows that any of this stuff ever happened. Is that also sort of like a crime against history? Is that invalidating legitimacy of the people who actually suffered through it? So I'm just really grappling with myself about should we be talking about this topic? Can I just let it go? Does the fact that others have asked, is she being a racist? Was she a racist? And some of her words that she wrote in her letters are very damning. She basically said, yeah, that's me. I'm raising my hand and saying, that's me. And I'm not going to apologize for it. But then something happened in that article, Joey, when she signed what I thought was the most damaging if we were at trial, like this would be like the mic drop moment of like, well, let's just read your own writings about whether you committed this crime or not, like let's just read what you said about it. She signed a letter to one of her friends, Mrs. Turpin, and Mrs. Turpin was a very prominent character in one of her very racially motivated and racially explicit short stories. So even in writing to one of her colleagues, one of her like best corresponding buddies, she's also putting on this persona because why didn't she sign the letter herself? Then that made me think about how badly we as human beings are about self-reporting, right? We think we know each other so well, and somebody else can take a look at you and be like, you see what's going on here right now, right? I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And like other people can see your blueprint for living maybe more than you can. So I'm really rambling here, but I'm really stirred up by this story and how Flannery O'Connor had kind of a limited life from the standpoint that she knew from a pretty young age that her father died of lupus when she was a young girl. That was kind of looming over her. So I think she wanted to do everything kind of in a hurry because she really wanted to experience all that she could. And she was well traveled, right? She had seen some things. She had been to St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City, which is like down the street from our book club friends in New York. I'm like, hey, I walked past there with you guys too. This is walking in the path of greatness. Yeah, it was just very interesting because I think people criticized her a lot for being, and the article talks about it, a regional writer. They were kind of trying to put her in a little box saying, "Oh, bless your heart, you're just this lady from Georgia who writes these kind of stories." And she's like, "Yes, I am. However, however, I think my works will stand the test of time, and obviously they have." So, Joy, I'm just going to pass it back over to you. I'm not exactly sure if I'm ever going to resolve my ambivalent feelings about her and her background. I am fascinated now to pick up, and then they said sort of every 10 years they released more information about her life. So like in 1970 a collection came out, and then in 1980 something else came out, and then 1989 something came out, and then they did a documentary about her. So I think the fact that there's still so much modern interest in this person who passed so long ago really is a trove for digging a little bit deeper and trying to sort this out.
Yeah, I think that she probably had some inner conflict when it came to her own racism and bigotry. Because she had written in, and it's written in the New Yorker article that she wrote to someone, I'm an integrationist by principle and a segregationist by taste, anyway. So she is acknowledging that she logically knows that she should not be racist, or at least she's saying she should be tolerant because she's saying there should be integration, but she is also self-aware enough to know that she has these racial biases that are standing in her way. And I think that she tries to really reconcile that idea in her work, at least to me. And again, from someone that is from the Black community, this is obviously the discussion that I can't have that discussion because that's not my lived experience. But from my perspective as a reader, I think, and I'll use good man is hard to find, that she is trying to highlight, or at least when you brought this up to Jennifer, that she is sort of showing us like this is how ridiculous this anecdote is about the little boy who eats the watermelon that has the initials E on it, and they're all like ha ha ha, and the little boy who's black who is walking around without any pants on, and she's like, the grandmother's like, oh, this is such a beautiful picture. It's like, yeah, it's all very uncomfortable to read, whether or not her intent as the author was to highlight, look how stupid this conversation is. We're all dumber for having heard this kind of thing. Or she's trying to highlight that she does have these feelings and she's not shying away from them because they are a part of her time. Racism obviously still exists, but the point is that this is something that would be a more socially acceptable story to say out loud and write it down and like have this proliferate. So I think she's sort of struggling with how do you overcome your sort of like inherent racism because you logically know as an intelligent person this is stupid and it's hurting a lot of people and it's not necessary and I should not be a part of it. But then we also see that she went to a Ku Klux Klan rally. So, like, I don't know that she actually did any work to like overcome her racism. Like we have a lot of resources now when it comes to becoming anti-racist, where there's lots of books, there's documentaries, there's movies, there's social media, there's so many resources that we can take to find this information. What resources did she have at this time? I don't know. I'm not saying she didn't have any. She did. She could go and find someone that was black and ask them questions if they felt comfortable answering, or if it's not their job to do that. But there are other things. There are other people that were writing. She could have read anything by Frederick Douglass. That would have probably been a pretty good place to start.
So,
Go ahead.
Joey, speaking of who she was reading, who she was talking to, who she was exposed to, she made some really offensive comments in her writing, which was reported in that article in the New Yorker about James Baldwin. And I don't even want to say the words out loud. Go read the article yourself, people, if you want to be shocked and appalled. Like, I was like, wait, did you just say that? And it was so abrupt, so critical, so demeaning of someone else's talent based on their race that I was like, wait a minute. How did you get away with saying these things? And more importantly, why are we repeating them? And so for part of me, there's that conflict of, well, should I draw attention to this really unsavory thing, this unsavory episode in your life, or should I let it pass? Because what is coming up for me, Joey, in this moment is that she went to New York City with her cousins. I think they were one of them was studying in college, and she sees these people on the subway. She's dealing with all kinds of different people, and she asked her cousin to sit on either side of her because she didn't want to sit next to a colored person. She said that. She wrote that down. That is what we know about her experience, and it felt so sad for me to know that that was like what was going through her mind and exposing herself to other opportunities to kind of get to know someone. As you said, it's like, oh, there are other resources today. We can seek out conversations with people. We can get educated. There's a lot of ways that we can get exposure to other cultural experiences that we're not currently having. And she seemed really shut down from that. She's like, oh, I've experienced it. And I'm just going to tell you right now, I don't like it. It's like me eating cilantro. I'm like, yeah, I tried it and I don't like it. And I'm done with that topic. And it just felt so, in some ways, good for you, Flannery O'Connor. You said, this is who I am. You wrote it in big letters. You got it published. You are standing by that. And there was a very compassionate moment in the article. And I listened to the audio of the article in the New Yorker, Joey.
Mhm.
And when it was a female narrator who was reading this article, and she said, we perhaps should not judge, and I'm going to misquote this, but my takeaway was, we perhaps should not judge someone's youthful ignorance or lack of experience. Don't judge their whole body of work. And she immediately said, but Flannery O'Connor lived to be 39 years old, and she was still having the same types of conversations that were these racially unsavory. I don't even know what other word to use. It just for me, it's just like, ugh, these conversations that really put her in a very bad light if you were a person who believes in racial harmony and the equality of all people to tell their story and live their life without being shamed, judged, or put down by any other people. And it was just a nice reminder for me as well of being true to yourself, but also allowing other people to be true to themselves. And where does that conflict lie in civil society? Because one of the things that she talks a lot of in the work, especially in A Good Man is Hard to Find, that we brought up, is that what are the social norms? What are the conventions in the society that we have built that you have to follow? The grandmother says, I'm a proper lady. I wear the hat. I wear the gloves. I need to signal outwardly to everyone that I am a woman of good breeding, good blood, good manners, and I am a lady. And you said something to me offline that I've been really mulling over, and I'm not quoting you directly, but this is what came up for me. Was Flannery O'Connor kind of trapped in the society in which she was living, where it would have been very difficult for her to change her mind? It would have been very difficult for her to buck these social conventions because it was so integrated into the world in which she was placed that maybe she didn't have the ability to step out of that. Does that sound like something we talked about?
I don't remember if I said that about the author. I did say that about the grandmother in the story, that there was only so much access that she would have had. But the same is true for Flannery O'Connor. She is living in 1950s Georgia in the American South. And so it's not going to be a great time for everyone, just for white people at this point. So
And
she
being
is,
a woman at that time wasn't even a real
yes,
picnic, right? Like
yeah, that's
that
true.
wasn't a huge privilege either.
Yeah, that's true. She had more privilege than the black community, of course, but yes, she also had to overcome obstacles because she was a woman. And that's, I think, why she dropped her first name, which is Mary, and became Flannery O'Connor, because people didn't know that she was a woman. Anyway, not that that's never happened. That's happened all the time. That happens all the time, or it did happen all the time. I think that it's hard for me to, okay, so I understand that like you're beholden to the era that you're in, and Flannery O'Connor, this was never gonna be a thought. I mean, there were people who are, of course, championing integration and tolerance and understanding, but she was not one of them. And I mean, if you grow up in a small, I'm assuming a rural town, because she talks about how she lived on a farm in rural Georgia, you're only exposed to so many types of people, and they're probably going to be poor white people. So with the same views as you. And so now you're in this echo chamber. So I can understand why she has no reason to really change her mind because she doesn't have to. She has the privilege that she's got and she wants to help maintain that. And I think you could see that in her white supremacist ideas about James Baldwin saying like he's not the right type of black person because first of all she's jealous. She's jelly of his writing because obviously James Baldwin. I mean, obviously Flannery O'Connor is an amazing writer, but also James Baldwin is an amazing writer. So I think there is this probably idea that she's like, well, why is he getting more accolades than I am? Because James Baldwin was very famous during his lifetime. He was on TV all the time. He was, oh, you know, he did a lot of things, and he was a public figure where Flannery O'Connor probably was not quite to that level. So I'm sure she was like, I have talent. Why should I be doing that? He is not white. He shouldn't be doing this kind of thing. I think like logically I know that, but emotionally I'm like, you could have done better. You could have seen that you're not the only human being in the world or the only type of human being in the world. And she was obviously very educated. She's smart. You cannot deny that Flannery O'Connor's writing is immaculate. She's an excellent writer, the best of the best. Okay, she deserves a spot in the canon, I think. But I think it's important to understand the nuance. And I think this is where, to tie it back to what we were beginning with here, of like, it's really important to know about the author and the history of the era that they're writing in. And the same thing with like Jane Austen. You lose part of the nuance of the text when you do not understand the era. So like with Jane Austen, I'll use as an example. Not that she talks about racism, really. Sometimes there's very few there. That's another conversation we can have. That's very interesting. But anyway, you don't get that there's slights. Like when in Emma, when Harriet is left alone and slighted by I don't remember the guy, the priest guy, when he's like, "Oh, I don't want to dance with you," and she's left alone. Like that was like a huge deal. But you don't get that because you don't understand, and Jane Austen's not explaining it. But anyway, my point is to say that you have to understand parts of history to understand the text. And I think it's important to read these texts that have blatant racism in it because that's the United States. Sorry about it, bruh. But that's real. That really happened. Stuff like this is still being said, unfortunately. So, like, we can't ignore it. We have to be like, yeah, this sucked. What she wrote sucked. That part sucked. But, like, you can interpret it how you want. Hopefully, you interpret it the right way, which is like, that's not right. That's not nice. You should not say that. That's intolerant. It's bigotry. It's racist. It's whatever. It's just like, that's not, you don't have to stand for that kind of thing. So I think it does still have a place. And I think other literary people in the article, it's mentioned like Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and some other writers saying like, yeah, this you should still read her. And I think it's Alice Walker actually. I guess not really a compliment, but she at least sort of explained like Flannery O'Connor said she did not feel capable of entering the mind of someone that's black. I'm not going to repeat the word that she actually used. So at least she admits like I can't write from the black perspective because I'm not black and I also don't want to. So it's yeah, it's a nuanced conversation, but I think like at least my I thinking is like, does she deserve to be in the canon today? Is there anything else that we can replace it? Obviously, canons, that's a very hot button topic, I think, for the literary community because like, well, who decides the canon? And it's straight white men and they're old straight white men. Obviously, we need to incorporate everybody. We need everyone's perspective to have a well balanced literary canon. It can't just be Dickens and Dostoevsky forever.
Yeah, Joey, thank you so much for saying that because one of the things that came up in that article, which I actually had some respect for, especially when she said, I'm not going to try to get into the mind of somebody who doesn't have my shared experience, right? The racial experience. She does not claim that she can have a nuanced conversation about what it feels like to be a black man. For example, when she was talking about James Baldwin. And in that respect, I really appreciated that maybe she's telling all of us because one of her and I was so angry when I can't even like articulate it because I'm so angry about it that she was like, James Baldwin, go ahead, tell me what it feels like to be a black man. You just go do that. That sounds great. But what I don't want you to do is tell me anything else about how the world works. And she was very dismissive in that comment of, yeah, you tell me that experience of yours, but don't try to tell me anything else. And so I'm curious, and that opened the door to me to think maybe what Flannery O'Connor was doing and thinking in her own life is stay in your lane. Write about your experience. Write about what it feels like to be you, a woman in this moment, witnessing your society. I don't think she, in her characters, that I haven't read a lot of her work, but I've definitely read A Good Man is Hard to Find. You don't get a lot of inner dialogue of like what the other people are experiencing. We have verbal dialogue, but she doesn't take us deep into the inner workings of someone's psychology. And I think that is perhaps how she lived her life as well. That she's like, everybody just stay in your lane, just be yourself. You don't have to say that you can speak for someone else. I thought that was very interesting for me to contemplate. I would like to leave it here with something I loved about her. I just loved, I was so charmed when I read this in the article that as a teenager she decided she was going to be a writer. So she like wrote a book of poems and she made some comics and she was just very precocious and very sure of herself that I am a writer. And I loved that confidence and the playfulness and that awkward bridging of the gap. Like I think they said that the stuff she wrote was too advanced for kids, but not nuanced enough for adults. So like she went through her awkward adolescence, but she didn't give up. And I think I really admire that. What
Mhm.
would our world have been like had she not followed through with the thing that really perhaps in her mind was her God-given gift, right? She was very much into fate and the meaning of religion and repetition and going to mass every day. And it's just, I think, this beautiful combination of circumstance, personality, opportunity. She talks about the access she has to writers and publishers when she goes to a writer's workshop. So she's acknowledging even back in 1950s, 1960s that if you aren't at the table, it doesn't matter how great you are as a writer. It does not matter how brilliant you are. If you can't get in front of the people who can put your work out there, you're toast. And I
Mhm.
just really appreciated the author of the article in the New Yorker of highlighting that insight that Flannery O'Connor had about her own path, that she needed to be in the rooms with people who could further her career. Her talent alone was not sufficient to get the word out.
Especially because she was a woman. I do want to say that I don't think it was in this article. I just tried to search for it, but it's a very scholarly discourse thing to talk about is the lack of internal monologue in her work. So you're picking right up on the correct stuff there because that's what she's been criticized for is because there's not really a lot going on in these characters' heads that we can see at least. Obviously, they would have thoughts, they're acting and doing things. But yeah, we don't get to see a lot of that. And it's curious, it's interesting, like why do we have that? Is it because of what you were explaining of she's not self-reflective, obviously. And is it because she just wants people to accept themselves for who they are? I would hope not, only because if you think that it's okay to just be racist because that's just how you are, then that's messed up. You should not be like, I'm intolerant of people, and that's okay because it's part of me, and I accept me, and I love me. It's like, no, some things you should not like about yourself, and that's up there. That's at the top. It's like if you have issues with other types of people that do not look like you and don't have the same lived experience, that's not like a cute personality trait. It's not like, oh, you know, I don't know, I tapped the door. No, that's OCD. Okay, whatever. You fill in the blank of a cute personality trait. Like you like to do a little dance when you eat. Okay, fine. Annoying to strangers probably, but fine. Not a personality flaw.
And not harmful to others as a result
Yes.
of your choice.
Yeah, yeah. That's something that you can educate yourself on. And again, I think it's really difficult to say that Flannery Connor could have done that. She physically could. She could have educated herself at any point on more about racism and how to be more anti-racist or just be anti-racist at all or just not be racist. Instead of being anti-racist, which is actively not being racist and calling out racism when you see it, she could have just not enacted she could have just learned and been better. But yeah, she is trapped in this era of this is a socially acceptable norm, and there was never a reason for her to change that. It's white supremacy. That's all it is. But I'm curious, do you think that she should still be in the literary canon? And if not, then who is a better replacement?
Yeah, I love that question, Joey, because I really don't want to take anybody out, right? It's like I would like to add more. I think that her beautiful plotting, her recognition of evil, her dialogue that is so localized and just effective. I'm like, that is a person who can write, right? And if we went back and edited, sometimes we talk about like, oh, could we edit anything out of this story? If I was quote unquote tidying up the story to make it less racially insensitive and yucky, for lack of a more technical term, I think some of those scenes could be edited out. The scene about the watermelon, the scene about the African American boy, walking around with no pants in poverty, that could have all been taken out, I think.
Well, it doesn't actually move the plot forward. It's
Well,
really
yeah.
not necessary to the story. It
Right. And
doesn't
the
give you
question is,
anything.
why did she do it? And it's like,
Yep.
well, I believe, as a result of our conversation right now, is that she did it because we don't have internal dialogue. So I can only make sense of who the grandmother is and what she's about by hearing what the grandmother says about the quote unquote good old days. And when she's talking about the good old days, she's talking about her suitor when she was young and hot and she had like a guy on the line and he was after her. And then she throws in this like ridiculous racial trope. And it's like, okay, grandma, I get what you're putting down. I see exactly who you are. I wish you were different, but you're not. And I think that is an interesting thing for me to contemplate looking at other characters because when we go back and the story is just very vivid to me right now. A good man is hard to find when she talks to the misfit and she's like, "You're a good man." It's like, "No, I'm not. I'm evil. You don't know me. I know me, and I know I'm evil. So thanks for trying to think better of me, but you don't know." And that, in the context of Flannery O'Connor telling us as readers and as her characters, stay in your own lane. You don't tell people who they are. You don't get to decide who people are and how they're acting and what they think. Those people are independent agents and they are being themselves for the reasons they only know. And yeah, I think that's just really kind of a fascinating thing. I don't want to use that as a criticism against her. I want to say, oh, isn't that an interesting limitation you put on yourself to say, I'm not going to explain in an inner monologue in the way that I'm writing this. I am going to let the reader observe and hear what a person says and let the reader decide why these things are happening. And I really like that in some ways, which is the exact opposite of someone like Virginia Woolf, because you know why everybody does everything because it's like me. And it's like, I always know, Joey, I always know what you're doing in my head, right? And it's like,
Hmm.
I don't know what it's like to be Joey, but I can imagine what it's like to be Joey. And so when you do a certain thing, I'll be like, oh, yeah, that's such a Joey thing to do. Of course, Joey would do that. And I think in some ways that's like an expression of my trying to connect with other people to say, oh, I get you. Like, I understand you. But I think it's also super limiting because how often can people get that totally wrong? Right? It's like, who am I to think that I know what your experience is like? So yeah, it's that really interesting fine line of being a Virginia Woolf of like, let me tell you every single thing I've ever thought
Too much.
today.
Yeah,
Or, just take a look at my face and tell your own story. The end. That was my whole short story. Look at my face. That's the story.
yeah.
Goodbye.
What's interesting about that one scene that you were just referring to when the grandmother says to the misfit, like, you're a good man or whatever. I don't remember what the exact line was, but it's probably that. What I thought you were gonna say, but I'm glad that you obviously have a different opinion. That's the point of this conversation. If we were just telling us, like, yeah, that's great. That's exactly what I thought. That would be boring. What I thought as you're talking about it was that she was trying to sort of say your whiteness is your signal of virtue. That by default, because you're a white man, you are a good man. And he's saying, no, 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 no. I am not. I didn't pretend to be. And Colin did mention this, and I 100% agree in the podcast that he says the Misfit is the only authentic character, that he lives completely honestly, even though it's horrendous and he's a murderer, that he's being 100% authentic. He's not trying to pretend to be someone he is not. But anyway, my point is that that's what I thought of when you were talking about it, is that Flannery O'Connor is sort of saying whether she meant it or not, I don't know. And I guess this definitely goes back to authorial intent, is that for me as the reader, I get like you're trying to say that people are good for the color of their skin and not by the actions or their own morality. So that's really interesting. And yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah, Joey, thank you. And I think this might be a great place for us to wrap up, but I do want to leave the door open for further conversations about Flannery O'Connor and about the canon in general. I think we've spoken in other podcast episodes and extra literary affairs of, do we make our own canon? If we were going to put together the top 100 stories, novels, films, songs, whatever it is that we wanted to put together to say, like, this is a representation of my world. This is how I became who I am. I think that's just like a really interesting thought exercise that I've been mulling over for 2025. Like, what are the key pieces of literature, art, music, all the things that I would want someone to know to understand me and my worldview. And I would love to have someone else say, this is what shaped me. Do you want to understand me? Here's like the little guidebook. Because when we think about the canon, like what does the canon even mean? And it's like when you say that to me, I'm like, oh, it's the kind of agreed upon list of what's good literature or good art or good music. Someone, and I don't know who this person is, someone, society has decided these are good things. These things have value. But I love the point that you brought out. It's like, well, who are the deciders? Because maybe I don't agree with the worldview of the people who are deciding this for me. And I really want to hear a Native American point of view, or I want to hear from someone who I haven't experienced yet. And maybe they have something even more impactful, maybe something even more beautiful and life-changing than the same old guys we've been hearing from for the last 400 years. And we're like, enough.
Looking at you, Shakespeare.
Oh no, don't take away Billy from me. Come on,
No, I don't think
Joey.
I also don't think we should remove people from the canon unless all of their stories are literally just about being a dick to people that
Correct.
are not white. It's like, well, then we're not gaining anything from that. But with Flannery O'Connor, we're gaining so much more. And again, I would be interested to read more, and I'm gonna do more research into like what are the reactions from people from the Black community or any person of color who is reading this and is like, that's a whole nother nuanced conversation that I don't know because I don't have that lived experience, obviously. But yeah, I think that she should remain because her writing itself is fantastic. And I think not that controversial writing is important. I don't think that. But I kind of think of her as sort of like Nabokov, where we have
Load.
Lolita, where like that's disgusting on so many levels, but it's so important to literature that it should remain. And I think the same thing with Flannery O'Connor. This is blatant racism, and we should absolutely recognize that, but we should also be able to see like this is actually great writing. This is how you tell a story effectively. This is structurally, this makes sense. We were just talking about the lack of inner monologue, but we do get glimpses of free and direct discourse. And I was talking about Jane Austen, who obviously everyone knows that's what she does. There's so many techniques that she's utilizing you don't get because the story is so captivating that it's not necessary. You don't have to think about, like, this is why this story is effective. You don't need to know that she's building up dread because you feel it. So there's like so much of an emotional aspect to the story and all great literature. It makes all of the technical aspects look super easy, number one, even though they're not and not necessary to know because they've done it so perfectly that it's no longer needed to talk about real. I mean, unless you're gonna like obviously do it for a scholarly reason, but yeah, just like reading it for fun or just because you're curious about what the canon's like it's not necessary because she's doing it so perfectly that you would have to dissect it. It's not going to be blatant.
Joey, I really appreciate that you said that because the image that came into my mind is that you can walk into a beautiful building and just know it's a beautiful building. You don't have to know about the tensile strength of the steel beams that went into it or how high the ceilings are or any of the infrastructure. You're just like, I am awed by the beauty that exists. And I don't have to know a single technical term to know that this is singularly beautiful. And that is
Yeah.
how I feel about literature. I'm like, you and Colin have such a beautiful background and can just pull these terms out of the air. And I was like, maybe I don't know the terms, but I know what it feels like to experience a beautiful sentence and a beautiful paragraph and this whole experience. And I think there's room for both of those scholarly intent and also just visceral experience. Thank you for joining us on Extra Literary Affairs, a lit fiction podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's deep dive. Remember, this series is here to complement our main show, so be sure to listen to get the full context. Until next time, remember, this is our little secret.